In 1950, David Reisman published a book called The Lonely Crowd. It was about a phenomenon that he and other academics had become aware of, a change in the American character. Reisman cited three types of motivation in the history of the American citizenry. The first was tradition-directed, the second was inner-directed, and the third was other-directed. Reisman argued that the tradition-directed form, doing as your forebears had done, especially as guided by rigorous religious doctrine, had been supplanted by the inner-directed form, what we might associate with the rugged individualist of the American pioneer era, and that had subsequently been supplanted by the other-directed model. Reisman likened it to people having invisible antennae sticking out of their heads, which they use to weigh the mood of the people they lived among and governed their behavior according to the ebb and flow of the mood of the crowd, the lonely crowd. I discussed how this eventuates in the modern world in an essay that I wrote, How You Came to Be Enslaved and How You Can Free Yourself. It's a very popular essay at selfadoration.com. It gets a whole lot of attention, both by inbound links and from search engine traffic. If you hear Reisman's categories, tradition-directed, inner-directed, other-directed, I invite you to consider tradition-directed is the cautious temperament, inner-directed is the driven temperament, and other-directed is the sociables having been led by the incandescents. It breaks out in disc form perfectly. Reisman didn't note this. I don't know if he was aware of disc or not. But the other interesting factor for me, also essentially omitted from Reisman's argument, is that the complexion of American education had changed dramatically between the time that the inner-directed were predominant on the American scene and the other-directed were ascendant in 1950. The conformist 50s, the man in the gray flannel suit, the world of the mass organization to which everyone was expected to conform himself. The change that happened in education started in 1913 and was culminated in 1918. This was led by the National Association of Education, and it is essentially the Marxist takeover of American schooling, American public schooling, private schooling too, for that matter. Prior to that, American education had been governed according to standards set by Charles Eliot, the Eliot Commission, which argued that since plausibly, presumably, predictably, so few students would continue on to college, that the primary and secondary education systems, the high school system in particular, should provide as much deeply rigorous education as was possible to cram into those 4 years. I can recall my great uncles sitting around the dinner table after a holiday feast, Thanksgiving or Christmas or Easter, sitting around the dining room table having arguments about trigonometry. No kidding. These were ordinary working guys. They were lunch pail guys who worked as tradesmen or skilled tradesmen in factories that existed downstream from the automobile business out of Detroit. I grew up in downstate Illinois, but Detroit was an enormous influence where I grew up. Detroit and the railroads. And these were ordinary working class guys who would routinely, commonly, have arguments about higher math and sketch out their arguments in equations on the tablecloth, all because they had had such a wonderful high school education. They were born in the early years of the 20th century. They were young enough that they missed the First World War, and yet they were old enough that they missed the Second World War. They were not the greatest generation. They were the generation prior to the greatest generation, and I like to think of them as the luckiest generation. They had truly world-class high school education, avoided 2 wars, lived wonderful middle-class existences, owned their own homes, in many cases owned more than one automobile at the same time, raised wonderfully competent, thoroughgoing children who went on to have wonderful middle class existences of their own, all of which was made possible by the Eliot Commission and its arguments for rigorous high school education, all of which was destroyed in 1918. And we see the Trump phenomenon and the Bernie Sanders phenomenon right now, and we wonder what the hell went wrong, and we want to blame teachers in schools now for indoctrinating our children in Marxism. No, the indoctrination in Marxism began in 1918 when we introduced health class and so-called physical education and the counseling department and all of the other make-work departments that exist only to provide useless jobs for useless minds who are employed in order to vote the union line. It's not even directly Marxist indoctrination. It's a mistake to think that it is. At the college level, you do have genuine, schooled, scholarly Marxists trying to inculcate Marxism in their students, but the second grade teacher is not a Marxist. She just grew up steeped in Marxism. And so did everyone else in the education system going back almost 100 years. And the net effect of this change in American high schools from the Eliot model aimed at a rigorous, thoroughgoing, completely balanced, a well-balanced education in math, science, literature, fine art, music, foreign language, everything that we would associate with an educated mind at the college level in 1950 or even as late as 1970, certainly not now. College students don't have any of those skills. They don't know any of those things. They are massively indebted ignorami. They know absolutely nothing, including why we say ignorami instead of ignoramuses, ignorant anuses. But this is the education that you would have had in 1895 or 1905 or even 1915, and the education that was essentially no longer available by 1925 and was gradually diminishing all through the 20th century to the point now that we have children who have no idea what the net consequences of Marxism are. The net consequences of Marxism are mass graves. This is the only thing that can result from Marxism because Marxism exists to convert invested capital into foodstuffs, which are then eaten, digested, excreted, and flushed. And once that invested capital is flushed, it cannot be retained. It cannot be brought back. It cannot be reinvested. And accordingly, in very short order, you have food shortages, toilet paper shortages, shortages of everything except steadily more worthless paper currency, and ultimately starvation, civil war, mass exterminations, and mass graves. This is the net consequence of socialism. The second grade teacher knows nothing about that. She knows none of that because she knows nothing in any case. She has no education of any sort. She knows nothing at all, except possibly what's on TV tomorrow night. And I think Reisman missed this massive change in the high schools, and therefore he missed the cause of this transition from the inner directed to the other directed. The Eliot model was ideally suited to producing inner directed people. It was ideally suited to cultivating the driven personality characteristics in every student who was in high school at that time. Obviously, the driven people didn't need to have their driven impulses cultivated, but the other students did need it, and the Eliot curriculum brought that out in them. It made for an inner-directed population. The greatest generation consisted of the last remnants of that inner-directed culture in the United States, and that's why they were the greatest generation. That's why they did the amazing things that they did, is because they were motivated from the inside out. The high school model brought to us by the National Education Association, brought to us by Karl Marx by way of his idiot minions in the NEA. That high school organization created an official hierarchy that was a cautious tyranny. It was all about responding to error rather than cultivating success. And it created an unofficial hierarchy that was an incandescent tyranny. The social hierarchy of the high school world is an incandescent tyranny. It's ruled by the incandescents at the top, who lord their social status over the sociables, who sneer at the cautious intellectual children who are the teachers' pets of the official hierarchy, and who shun and exclude the driven personalities by pushing them off into shop class and home ec class and pushing them out of high school altogether by making it easy to quit. Marxism is the temporary and catastrophic mutiny of the cautious over the driven, and the Marxist control of the United States was effected by this takeover of the high schools, the grade schools, all schools, in 1918. This is not a new phenomenon. It's not recent. It's not something that can be quickly corrected because the second grade teacher doesn't know she's a Marxist. She just engages in continuous Marxist inculcation because that's the water she swims in. The interdirected phenomenon that Reisman was noting was that cautious tyranny in the official high school curriculum and the incandescent tyranny in the unofficial high school social hierarchy. This is what created that mass of interdirected people, was that incandescent tyranny that made all of the sociables terribly afraid that they might be temporarily and inconsequentially in the wrong about something that matters not at all, makes no difference whatever. I want to be seen green, I wouldn't be caught dead red. This is what made the sociables behave that way, and this is what created the interdirected world that Reisman was decrying. This is Onyx, the last of our black cats, who is caterwauling right now. I hope he's not in pain. I think he's probably just lonely. I bring all this up because the sixth rule of the Church of Splendor is keep your own counsel. The seventh rule is look out for your own. And just taking account of those two rules, you understand that the Church of Splendor and selfadoration.com and my entire philosophical argument is an interdirected argument. I am interdirected, I am driven. But keep your own counsel is what those poor, benighted, sociable people do not do. They yield to the incandescents and they yield to the herd because they're afraid of being called out for being in the wrong. And it's the cautious tyrants in the schools who have trained them to live in fear of being called out for being meaninglessly and inconsequentially in the wrong about things that don't matter at all anyway. The Tiger Mom phenomenon, the note-for-note music instruction that decries every little misstep in a performance rather than applauding the whole. We cite 101 defects and create student musicians, students of all types, who live in terror of making the tiniest errors rather than seek the delight of achieving something meaningful, even if it's slightly defective here and there. This is a real mistake. This is a terrible mistake, and I cite it because I want you thinking about it in your own families. We are talking about the little Testudo schoolhouse, schooling your own, and whether or not you submit your children to some sort of outside schooling, whether it's public schooling or private schooling, whether or not you submit your children to that, you need to be aware of the Marxist, collectivist, incandescent, cautious, tyrannical influences that the world at large is imposing upon them all the time from all sides, and you need to be counterbalancing those at home. So ideally, the best education you could provide for your children is homeschooling, and by homeschooling I mean a serious, rigorous, classical education, the Latin Trivium when they're young, and a extremely well-balanced high school education, much alike to the Eliot curriculum. Math, sciences, literature, fine arts, music, foreign language, possibly supplemented by overseas travel if you can afford it, but a rigorous homeschooled education is the ideal education you could provide for your children. But if you cannot do that, and I easily could understand why you cannot do that because you are being bled white by taxes, you have to work so hard in order to provide a home for your family in any case, even if your children are partaking of their schooling outside the home, you need to be supplementing within the home in order to cultivate the driven personality characteristics that the rest of the world wants to eradicate. I cited the essay Propositions 3 and 7 by Richard Mitchell this week at selfadoration.com. All of this, Mitchell is wonderfully worth reading, and you will learn so much about what went wrong in education by reading Richard Mitchell. You can find all of his works at sourcetext.com. Source text is one word. Sourcetext.com. The entire collection of the Underground Grammarian newsletters is there, but Mitchell's 4 books are provided for free in their complete form. Mark Alexander, who runs the site, has other books that are available there, and I think Mark Alexander is a very interesting intellectual, worth pursuing separately, but the time that you invest with him right now should be devoted to Richard Mitchell, because you will learn so much about how education was destroyed. But even more important than learning how education was destroyed is learning how to fix it, and the way to fix it is the way that I've described right here, by recognizing that the world at large is at war with the inner direction, the driven character attributes of your children, and doing what's necessary to cultivate their own inner moral lodestone, their own inner intellectual lodestone, so that they cannot be herded, hounded by the mob, so they cannot become part of a mass movement aimed at the destruction of Western civilization, so they do not become the next bodies to be thrown onto the mass grave. Keep your own counsel. Look out for your own. And the way that you'll do that is by schooling your own. This is the Church of Splendor. My name is Greg Swan. I'm so glad to talk to you, and I'll talk to you again next week.